On this day, the 20th of January, 1963, the confrontation between Malaysia and Indonesia began. Indonesia was opposed to the formation of Malaysia and made its views very plain. The creation of Malaysia was the merger of the Malay Federation, which had become independent in 1957, Singapore, British North Borneo, and Sarawak in 1963. After the independence of the Dutch East Indies as the United States of Indonesia, Sukarno became the president, and at first was a president that was a bit hands-off. He allowed the parliamentary system to work or not work as it did, and he tried to balance the various factions, the secularists, the Islamists, the communists. And during that time there had been rebellions, there had been weak governments that had fallen because of the fractured nature of Indonesian politics. There had been attempts in places like Aceh and Sulawesi of various places trying to break off and become independent of Indonesia. But the arch anti-imperialist wasn't about to allow his Javanese empire to fall apart. In fact, he was intent on extending it. One place that he definitely wanted was Dutch New Guinea. After the Dutch had conceded Indonesian independence, they had kept half of the island of New Guinea, as they stated that it being a different group of people, a different race, and a very different geography, far away from the center of Indonesia, that it should become independent as a separate country. And so they hung on to it. But Sukarno, as he became more authoritarian within Indonesia, began to start rattling his sabers. Between 1950 and 1962, he would bring up the Dutch New Guinea situation in the UN, where mostly it was dismissed. But he went beyond that. With Soviet arms, he would get his forces to infiltrate Dutch New Guinea. They were defeated by the Dutch each time, and the Dutch and the natives together fighting against the Indonesians. But eventually it got to the point where the United States wanted Sukarno to be their friend. They didn't want him to go off with the communist bloc. And so they started putting pressure on the Dutch to give New Guinea over to the UN, which eventually the Dutch did. And the Indonesians were then handed Dutch New Guinea, and one of the things that the Dutch tried to insist on was that there should be a referendum on whether they wanted to become part of Indonesia or become independent. They held a referendum in 1969, but many people consider it to be a lot of ballot stuffing, and that people think that it probably wasn't the true result. One of the problems in New Guinea is that many of the people live out in the middle of nowhere. They live in little villages, they have no contact with the outside world, and it wouldn't be very difficult for the Indonesians just to ship people in to vote specifically for the referendum. Anyway, but Sukarno got what he wanted. He managed to grab this piece of territory, expand Indonesia up to the borders of Papua New Guinea. Now he turned his sights northward. His imperial ambitions did not stop at New Guinea. So, emboldened by the Dutch backdown, he was looking north towards Malaya and the British colonies of Sarawak and British North Borneo and the British Protectorate of Brunei. Sukarno saw something ripe for the picking. And at this point, it had been announced that a new state, Malaysia, would be formed from the Federation of Malaya and the British colonies of Sarawak and British North Borneo. At that point, it wasn't clear whether Brunei would join. It didn't in the end, and only became independent in the 1980s. But at the time, there was some thought towards them becoming a part of Malaysia. So this went with Britain's tried and tested attempts to amalgamate many of their smaller colonies into a larger federation. They didn't want little countries to be out there by themselves, weak and defenceless. So Sarawak and British North Borneo, being small and out of the way, would be better off as part of a larger federation with Malaya. Sukarno didn't like this. He accused the Malayans and of being British puppets, and said Malaysia would be nothing but a British puppet state. So, after this, there was a revolt in Brunei. It was easily put down by Gurkhas flown in from Singapore. However, it was surmised that the rebels had been funded by Sukarno's government. He denied it, they denied it, but it does seem that it was the beginning of what the Indonesians would call the Konfrontasi with Malaysia. So, it began on this day, but it was only a bit later on that they started calling it the Konfrontasi. Now, there were also problems in Malaya because there had been for over a decade communist insurgency, and that had not unaffected the rest of it. There were still Chinese communist infiltrators in Sarawak, which was on the island of Borneo, and so it seems that Sukarno, who was cozying up to the communists in China, in the Soviet Union, North Vietnam, North Korea, and later on in Cambodia. So he would cozy up to them, but he also cozied up to them at home, which eventually would lead to his downfall. He got too friendly with them and allowed them to infiltrate too many parts of the government and army, and that's when things happened in Indonesia. Sukarno had also talked about a desire for a greater Indonesia, including not just Indonesia and Malaysia, but the Philippines as well. So he had this idea of a country called Mapilindo. So I suppose it's Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. Mapilindo. And the idea was to have this massive empire, really, in Southeast Asia, which would be one of the great powers of the world. And that was something he was into, and had talked about, and had allowed to be talked about. So, that is the Konfrontasi. After the beginning of this confrontation, in April of 1963, the first attack on British North Borneo began. It was a raid that came in from Kalimantan, the Indonesian part of Borneo. As I said, they'd been funding Chinese communists and allowing communists to come into Kalimantan and used as a refuge. So, after 1963, and the establishment of Malaysia, because Malaysia was established, and against his will, Indonesia refused to recognize it, and they left the United Nations when Malaysia was allowed in to the United Nations. He tried to set up, Sukarno tried to set up a rival to the UN, and it didn't work, obviously, but he was trying to get People's Republic of China, which wasn't a part of the UN at the time, as well as various other communist countries, to set up a rival UN. And so he also started infiltrating and attacking the Malay Peninsula itself. They would send over, by boat and helicopter, dozens, ending up being hundreds, of troops over to the Malayan mainland, where many of them were caught, mostly caught, and this ended up leading to the British, the Australians and the New Zealanders increasing their troop numbers. Obviously Malayans themselves, plus Singaporeans and Bruneians were involved, so it became a standoff at this point. And it was seen that Sukarno was becoming dangerously unhinged. And at this point, the MI6, CIA, started to put round propaganda outside of Indonesia, but also inside, and they started to help fund Sukarno's enemies. So, in 1964, Sukarno declares that that year will be the year of living dangerously. So he basically came out and said that he was going to be reckless in the next year, probably thinking that he was going to take Malaysia. So his incursions into Malaya and caused the Commonwealth forces to carry out what they called Op Claret, and this was cross-border raids or aggressive defense against Indonesia. This would take place on the island of Borneo, and they would go across from British North Borneo and Sarawak into Kalimantan, and they would see if they could find forces that were ready to come over and to attack them in the north of Borneo. And it was a very successful op. It ended up crippling the Indonesian forces and the forces that they were funding. And it got to the point where between these military successes and the propaganda put out, that a coup in Indonesia began on the 30th of September 1965. It's very unclear as to who was involved, but senior military men were killed. Sukarno was quote-unquote kidnapped. They tried to blame it on the communists. The communists denied it, but it seems that Sukarno was involved somehow in something. Some people say that Sukarno made up this coup thing. Maybe it went wrong. Maybe he was trying to get something to get more power. But whatever happened, it came back on him and the communists. And Sukarno ended up putting Suharto, the general, in charge. And Suharto basically put Sukarno under house arrest. And between them and civilians within the population and the army, they liquidated many of the communists. So some say it was like 70,000-80,000 were killed. Some say up to 1 million. Some say 500,000. It's hard to know. But after this, communism in Indonesia was put underfoot. But also what this meant was, with Suharto in control, he came and recognized Malaysia. and he rejoined the UN, and they called off the funding for the rebel groups in Sarawak and British North Borneo, and agreed that Malaysia was going to exist. So, if you like these videos, come back tomorrow for more. Subscribe, like, and comment.